A chilly afternoon in Granville. It was a crisp afternoon in Granville, a small city nestled in the heart of the state. The city was a perfect blend of the past and present, where towering modern high-rises stood side by side with small, family-owned businesses that had been around for decades. The streets were lined with the last remnants of autumn, amber and gold leaves fluttering in the cool breeze. Despite the picturesque scene, there was an underlying tension in the air, an unspoken tension that permeated the city. Donna Carter, a poised and graceful woman in her early 30s, walked out of her favorite local cafe. She frequented this spot, a small, cozy cafe with wooden floors and the smell of freshly ground coffee beans that made it feel like home. Dana was well known in the community, but not in the way one might expect. She was married to Ethan Carter, the city's police commissioner. Though her husband's position came with a certain level of public visibility, Dana preferred to live her life away from the spotlight. She never wanted to be treated differently because of who her husband was. Today, like every other day, she kept to herself, content with the small pleasures of life, like a warm cup of coffee on a cold day. As she stepped out of the cafe, sipping her latte and enjoying the brisk air, she noticed two police officers approaching her. At first, she thought nothing of it. The police were a common sight around Granville, ensuring the peace in this small but growing city. However, something about the way the officers were looking at her felt off. Their gazes were sharp, scanning her as though she had done something wrong. Dana's instincts immediately kicked in, but she forced herself to stay calm. She hadn't done anything wrong. There was no reason to be concerned. The officers, Blake and Thomas, stopped abruptly in front of her, blocking her path. The street around them was bustling with people, yet it felt like everything had gone still. Dana stopped walking and looked up at the officers, her confusion evident on her face. "Excuse me, ma'am," Officer Blake said in a flat tone. His eyes never left hers as he crossed his arms in a stance that felt more confrontational than professional. "We need to ask you a few questions." Dana blinked, surprised but still composed. She had been raised to handle situations like this with grace and patience. "Is something wrong, officers?" she asked, her voice steady. The officers exchanged a glance, and then Officer Thomas stepped forward. He was younger than Blake, and his posture was rigid, as if trying to mimic authority. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," he said. "We need to search you." A wave of confusion swept over Dana. Suspicious activity. She had just left a cafe, like she did almost every day. Suspicious activity, she echoed, incredulous, but trying to remain polite. "I'm sorry, but I just come from the cafe over there. Is there a specific reason you need to search me?" Blake's face hardened, and he unfolded his arms, taking a step closer to her. His eyes narrowed as though her questioning him was an act of defiance. "Are you refusing a search, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low and intimidating. Dana's pulse quickened. This wasn't right. She hadn't refused anything, but this felt wrong. The officers' attitudes, their sharp tones, it all felt like a threat. But she also knew that refusing or resisting in any way could make things worse. She had seen enough stories in the news to know how quickly things could escalate, especially for someone like her, a black woman in a predominantly white city. "I'm not refusing," Dana said, keeping her voice as calm as she could, though her heart was beginning to race. "But I'd like to understand why you need to search me. I haven't done anything wrong." Without another word, Officer Thomas stepped closer, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The metallic glint of the cuffs caught the sunlight as he reached for her. "Turn around," he ordered, his voice sharp and lacking any of the politeness or professionalism she had been trying to maintain. Dana was stunned. This couldn't be happening. "Search me. But why?" she asked, her voice rising slightly as the anxiety started to bubble up inside her. "I haven't done anything wrong." Blake's expression darkened. "Turn around, ma'am. Don't make this harder than it has to be." People on the street walked by quickly, averting their eyes from the scene unfolding before them. No one wanted to get involved. The city had an unspoken rule about not questioning authority, especially when the situation looked tense. Dana felt the weight of their judgmental or fearful gazes as she reluctantly turned around, knowing that resisting in any way could lead to something far worse. She felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap around her wrists, the bite of the cuffs both physically painful and emotionally humiliating. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. As Officer Thomas began a rough and aggressive pat-down, pulling at her coat and rummaging through her handbag, Dana felt a deep sense of humiliation wash over her. She had always prided herself on her strength and dignity, but standing there, cuffed and searched in the middle of the street for no apparent reason, that dignity felt like it was slipping away with every second. The search didn't take long. There was nothing to find, of course, but the damage was done. As Thomas stepped back, Blake stood in front of her, arms crossed, still glaring at her as if he expected her to confess to something. "You sure you're not hiding anything, lady?" he asked, his tone mocking. Dana's jaw tightened, but she refused to lose her composure. "I'd like to call my husband," she said, her voice firm despite the knot of emotion rising in her throat. Blake let out a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Oh, and who's your husband? Go ahead, call him. Let's see who he is." Dana pulled her phone from her pocket with trembling hands and dialed the one number she knew could put an end to this. The phone rang only twice before a deep, commanding voice answered. "Donna? What's wrong?" It was Ethan Carter, her husband, the police commissioner of Granville. Dana took a deep breath, keeping her voice as steady as she could. "They're searching me, Ethan," she said, glancing at the officers who were now watching her with growing impatience. "Officers Blake and Thomas. They've cuffed me and searched me for no reason." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Ethan's voice came back, this time colder, sharper. "Where are you?" "Olive and Maple. I just left the cafe," Dana explained, her pulse beginning to calm as she heard the protective edge in her husband's voice. "I haven't done anything wrong, but they're treating me like a criminal." "I'll be there in 5 minutes," Ethan said, his voice firm and unwavering. As Donna hung up, she stood a little taller. She knew Ethan would be there soon, and with him, this nightmare would end. But even with that knowledge, the humiliation and frustration of the situation gnawed at her. Why had this happened? Why had they singled her out? She couldn't shake the feeling that she already knew the answer. The wait for Ethan felt like an eternity, though it was only a few minutes. Finally, a black SUV sped down the street and came to an abrupt halt. The door swung open, and out stepped Ethan Carter, tall, broad-shouldered, and imposing in his police commissioner's uniform. His face was a mask of controlled anger as he strode toward them. The officers froze the moment they saw him. They recognized him immediately, and any confidence they had before quickly drained away. "Commissioner Carter," Blake stammered, stepping forward, his previous arrogance replaced by nervousness. Ethan's cold gaze silenced him. "Step aside," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. The weight of authority. As the black SUV pulled to a stop, the air around Olive and Maple seemed to thicken. It was as if the weight of what was about to unfold pressed down on the street, causing everything and everyone to pause. The pedestrians who had been trying to avoid the scene now found themselves frozen, their curiosity winning over their desire to stay out of the situation. Some stood with their phones discreetly pointed in the direction of the police commissioner, while others watched in silent anticipation. Ethan Carter emerged from the SUV with a powerful, commanding presence. His uniform, sharp and immaculate, gleamed in the pale afternoon sun. His face was hard, jaw clenched, and his eyes, usually warm when he looked at his wife, were now cold, locked on Officers Blake and Thomas with an intensity that made both men shift nervously on their feet. The commissioner's strides were long and purposeful as he made his way towards Donna, his eyes flicking briefly to her handcuffed wrists. His expression darkened. The two officers stood stiff, unsure of themselves for the first time since the confrontation began. Their previous confidence, the bravado with which they had searched Dana and cuffed her, had evaporated the moment they saw who she had called. Blake swallowed hard as Ethan approached, his mind racing for an explanation, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. Ethan stopped a few feet in front of them, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the two officers. His eyes never left theirs as he spoke, his voice cold and authoritative. "Step aside," he ordered again, his tone leaving no room for argument. Without hesitation, both Blake and Thomas moved back, though the nervous tension between them remained palpable. Ethan turned to Dana, his expression softening for a brief moment as he reached out to gently touch her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and filled with concern. Dana nodded, though the humiliation still weighed heavily on her. The sight of her husband brought her a sense of relief, but it couldn't erase the sting of what had just happened. "I'm fine," she said quietly, but her eyes, filled with unshed tears of frustration, told a different story. Ethan's gaze flickered back to the officers, and in an instant, the softness in his expression disappeared, replaced by a cold fury. He turned to Blake and Thomas, his voice now sharp and biting. "Explain yourselves." Blake shifted on his feet, looking to Thomas for support, but the younger officer seemed frozen, his face pale. Blake cleared his throat, trying to gather his thoughts. "Sir, we were responding to a report of suspicious activity in the area," he began, though his voice wavered. Mrs. Carter matched the description given. "And we." Ethan cut him off, his eyes narrowing. "Matched the description? What description was that?" Blake faltered, glancing nervously at Thomas before continuing. We received a call about a woman loitering near the cafe, acting suspiciously. Dark clothing, medium height, and," Ethan pressed, stepping closer to the officers. "Did she resist? Did she make any threats?" Blake's mouth opened, but no words came out. He glanced at Thomas again, silently pleading for backup, but Thomas remained silent, his gaze fixed on the ground. Finally, Blake shook his head. "No, sir. She didn't resist, but we were just following protocol." Ethan's eyes flashed with anger. "Protocol? Your protocol is broken," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You saw a black woman standing outside a cafe and decided that was enough reason to search her and slap cuffs on her like she was a criminal. Is that what you call following protocol?" Blake's face flushed, and he shifted nervously. "Sir, we were just doing our jobs." Ethan took a step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerously low tone. "Doing your job doesn't mean abusing your authority, Officer Blake, and it certainly doesn't mean treating people with suspicion simply because of the color of their skin." For a moment, silence fell between them, the weight of Ethan's words hanging in the air. Blake opened his mouth to respond, but the commissioner raised a hand, cutting him off before he could speak. "I'm not interested in your excuses," Ethan said, his voice cold and firm. "What I'm interested in is ensuring that this kind of behavior doesn't happen again, not to my wife or to anyone else in this city." Dana, who had remained quiet during the exchange, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of emotions. She was grateful for her husband's support, but she couldn't shake the deep sense of humiliation that still clung to her. The feeling of being singled out, of being judged and mistreated simply because of her appearance, weighed heavily on her heart. As Ethan turned back to her, his expression softened once more. "Let me get those off you," he said gently, reaching for the handcuffs. But before he could, Officer Blake stepped forward, fumbling with his keys. "I'll do it, sir," he said quickly, his voice tinged with a mix of guilt and desperation. With shaky hands, he unlocked the cuffs, releasing Dana's wrists. Dana rubbed her wrists, the cold metal having left faint red marks on her skin. She looked at Blake, her expression unreadable. Part of her wanted to lash out, to demand answers, but she knew that no explanation could undo the damage that had been done. She simply nodded, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you." Blake stepped back, his face pale and his hands trembling. Thomas, who had remained silent throughout the entire ordeal, finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't mean any harm, ma'am. We were just trying to do our jobs." Dana's eyes flickered toward him, but she didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Ethan, however, wasn't finished. He turned back to the officers, his voice cold and commanding once more. "This isn't over," he said, his tone leaving no doubt that there would be consequences for their actions. "I want both of you to report to my office first thing tomorrow morning. We'll be discussing this further." Blake nodded quickly, his face still flushed with embarrassment. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir." Without another word, Ethan turned back to Dana, offering her his arm. "Let's go," he said gently, and Dana, grateful to be leaving the scene, slipped her arm through his. As they walked toward the SUV, the crowd that had gathered around them began to disperse, the tension slowly dissipating. Some of the onlookers whispered to each other, their voices filled with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Others simply walked away in silence, eager to return to their daily lives, having witnessed something that they might talk about for weeks to come. But for Dana, the moment wasn't something she could easily walk away from. As she sat in the passenger seat of the SUV, staring out the window, she couldn't help but replay the events over and over in her mind. The humiliation, the fear, the feeling of being powerless in a situation where she had done nothing wrong. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, his expression still hard. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them thick with unspoken emotion. Finally, Ethan broke the silence, his voice low and filled with frustration. "I'm so sorry, Dana." Dana turned to him, her expression softening. "It's not your fault, Ethan," she said quietly. "You weren't the one who treated me like that." Ethan shook his head, his jaw clenched. "But I am responsible for those officers, for the way they behave, the way they treat people. This is my city, Dana, and what happened to you shouldn't have happened to anyone. I'll make sure they're held accountable." Dana nodded, though she knew that accountability wouldn't erase the pain of the experience. As the SUV pulled away from Olive and Maple, she rested her head against the window, watching the city pass by in a blur of buildings and people. Granville, the city she had called home for so long, suddenly felt different. It felt colder, more distant. In the back of her mind, a question lingered, a question she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. Could this place, this city she loved, ever truly change? Or was the prejudice she had just experienced so deeply ingrained that it would always be there, lurking beneath the surface? As the SUV merged onto the highway, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road ahead. Dana closed her eyes, trying to find some sense of peace in the quiet hum of the engine, but the echoes of the day's events followed her, refusing to be left behind. Ripples of injustice. The drive home was silent, but not the comfortable kind of silence that Dana and Ethan were used to. This was a silence filled with tension, emotions unspoken but hanging heavy in the air. The soft hum of the SUV's engine seemed to amplify the thoughts swirling in Dana's mind. She stared out of the window, her eyes tracing the familiar streets of Granville. But everything looked different now. The city, once warm and inviting, now felt alien, as though its charm had faded in the harsh light of reality. The shadows of the evening stretched across the streets, mimicking the long shadows of doubt now cast over her trust in the place she called home. As they drove past the familiar landmarks, the park where they often went for walks, the school where they had attended community events, the police station where Ethan had spent countless hours, it was impossible for Dana not to feel a sense of betrayal. These places were woven into the fabric of her life, but today they felt tainted. How could the city she loved allow such an injustice to happen? And if it could happen to her, the wife of the police commissioner, what about the countless others who didn't have that privilege? Ethan was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His jaw was set, the muscles in his face tense. Dana knew him well enough to recognize when he was holding something back, but she didn't press him. Not yet. She was still processing what had happened herself. She wasn't ready to talk about it, not when the anger and humiliation were still so raw. But she could feel it, simmering just beneath the surface, the weight of the day pressing down on them both. Finally, as they turned into their driveway and the car came to a stop, Ethan exhaled deeply, as if he had been holding his breath the entire ride. He turned to Dana, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and frustration. "Dana," he began, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Dana looked at him, her face soft but unreadable. She knew what he wanted to say. He was angry, not just at the officers, but at himself. He was the commissioner, and he felt responsible. He wanted to apologize, to make it right somehow, but there was nothing he could say that would change what had happened. "I know," Dana said quietly, cutting him off before he could continue. "But it's not something you can fix with an apology." Ethan's eyes flickered with pain, but he nodded. He knew she was right. No matter what action he took against the officers, the damage had already been done. He could discipline them, make an example of them, but it wouldn't erase the memory of how his wife had been treated on that cold street. It wouldn't undo the humiliation she had felt, being cuffed and searched like a common criminal in front of everyone. They got out of the car and walked into their home in silence. The house was warm and inviting, filled with the soft glow of evening light filtering through the windows. Normally, it was a place of comfort, a refuge from the stresses of their public lives. But tonight, even home felt different. Dana set her bag down on the kitchen counter and walked into the living room. She stood by the window, looking out at the darkening sky. Ethan followed her, but stopped at the doorway, watching her from a distance. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension between them, but he knew that this wasn't the kind of problem that words could solve. After a long moment, Dana spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I've always known that being married to the commissioner would come with certain challenges, the public scrutiny, the pressure. But I never thought." She trailed off, her hand absently tracing the edge of the window frame as she searched for the right words. "I never thought I'd be treated like that." Ethan walked over to her, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and she turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and resolve. "I know you didn't ask for any of this," Ethan said softly, "and I know it's not fair. None of it is. But I'll make sure those officers are held accountable, Dana. I swear to you, they won't get away with this." Dana looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity and the frustration there. She knew Ethan meant every word. He would do everything in his power to ensure that justice was served. But there was a deeper issue here, one that went beyond just two officers making a mistake. This was about something much larger, a system that allowed those officers to feel justified in their actions. It was about the prejudice that had been lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment to rear its ugly head. "It's not just about those two," Dana said, her voice firm. "It's about the way they looked at me, Ethan. The way they assumed I was guilty before I even said a word. That's the problem. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a threat, as someone who didn't belong." Ethan's face tightened, and his eyes flickered with anger again. "I know," he said through clenched teeth. "Believe me, I know. And that's why I have to do more than just punish them. I have to look at the whole department, at the whole system, and figure out where we went wrong." Dana nodded, appreciating his resolve, but part of her wondered if it would be enough. Could one man, even a police commissioner, really change a system that had been built on decades of bias and inequality? Could he dismantle the deep-seated prejudices that were woven into the very fabric of the city's law enforcement? "I trust you," Dana said after a moment, "but I don't want you to just fix this for me. I want you to fix it for everyone." Ethan held her gaze for a long time, and then he nodded. "I will," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I'll make sure this never happens again, to you or to anyone else." But even as he said the words, Dana could see the doubt in his eyes. He wanted to believe he could change things, but they both knew that real change would take more than just one man's promise. The next morning, Dana woke up feeling the weight of the previous day still hanging over her. She had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with fragments of the encounter with the officers, flashes of their harsh words, the cold snap of the handcuffs around her wrists, the way people had looked at her as though she were something less than human. She had hoped that sleep would offer her some respite, but instead, it had only brought more reminders of the injustice she had faced. Ethan had left early for the station, determined to confront Officers Blake and Thomas. He had kissed Dana on the forehead before he left, promising her once again that he would handle it. But Dana knew that this was only the beginning. She had seen the way things worked in Granville. Even with Ethan's authority, there would be resistance. People didn't like to admit when there was a problem, especially not when it came to race. As she sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, Dana's phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at the screen and saw a text from her friend and neighbor, Angela. "Saw what happened yesterday. Are you okay?" Dana stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "I'm fine. Just shaken up." Angela's reply came quickly. "It's all over the news, Dana. People are talking about it everywhere. I can't believe those officers treated you like that." Dana felt a knot form in her stomach. She hadn't realized that the story had spread so quickly. Of course, it had. Someone must have recorded it, and now the whole city would be talking about it. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. On one hand, it brought attention to the injustice she had faced, but on the other hand, she hated the idea of being the center of attention for something so humiliating. "I'll be okay," Dana typed back, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. Angela sent one more message before Dana set her phone down. "If you need anything, I'm here. You don't have to go through this alone." Dana smiled faintly at her friend's words. It was comforting to know that people cared, but there was also a part of her that felt isolated, as though no one could truly understand what she had gone through. Not even Ethan, despite his love and his position of power, could fully grasp what it felt like to be treated the way she had been. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. It was a peaceful morning, but Dana couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The world felt different now, and she knew that her life, and her view of the city she had once loved, would never be the same again. Confrontation and resolution. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Dana found herself engulfed in a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She knew the implications of what had happened. The incident with Officers Blake and Thomas wasn't just a personal affront. It had opened up a broader conversation about race, power, and justice in Granville. And while she wanted to retreat from the spotlight, she also felt a rising sense of responsibility. If she remained silent, the injustice would linger in the shadows, continuing to affect others like her. After a restless morning, she decided to take charge of her day. Fueled by a mix of anxiety and determination, Dana pulled out her laptop and began researching local organizations that focused on civil rights and community policing. She wanted to understand the landscape of activism in Granville and see how she could contribute. She had always admired those who fought for justice, but had never thought of herself as one of them. As she read, Dana learned about grassroots movements that had gained momentum in recent years, pushing for transparency and accountability within the police force. These organizations held community forums, educated citizens about their rights, and advocated for policy changes that addressed systemic bias. She felt inspired. Perhaps her voice could add to this chorus of change. Just as she was jotting down notes, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Ethan. His tone was serious when she answered, and Dana braced herself for what he had to say. "Dana, I'm meeting with the officers involved in your incident this afternoon," Ethan said. "I want you to know that I'll be addressing everything head-on. I won't let them brush this under the rug." His determination made her heart swell with pride, but it also brought a twinge of fear. "What are you going to say?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm going to confront them about their actions. "This isn't just a disciplinary issue. It's a moral one," he replied. "I want them to understand the gravity of what they did, and I want to ensure that our department understands that we will not tolerate this kind of behavior." Dana nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I trust you, Ethan. Just be careful. I don't want you to get caught up in the politics of it all. You need to be strong, but you also need to know when to push and when to hold back." "I'll be cautious," he assured her, "but I won't back down." After the call ended, Dana took a deep breath. She admired Ethan's resolve, but she also understood the complexities he faced. Being the police commissioner came with its own set of challenges, and she worried that he might find himself navigating a minefield of political ramifications and pushback from his own department. As the afternoon wore on, Dana decided to attend the community meeting organized by one of the local civil rights groups. She needed to be around others who understood her experience and who could help her channel her emotions into something productive. The meeting was being held at the Granville Community Center, a place where residents often gathered for everything from neighborhood watch meetings to cultural festivals. When she arrived, the room was buzzing with conversation. A mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces greeted her, all with their own stories to share. As Dana walked in, she felt a sense of belonging that had been missing since the incident. It was comforting to be surrounded by people who shared her commitment to social justice. The meeting began with a local activist named Marcus leading the discussion. He was a dynamic speaker with a presence that filled the room. He shared stories of past encounters with law enforcement that had ended in tragedy or injustice, each tale echoing the sentiments Dana had felt during her own experience. "As a community, we need to hold our leaders accountable," Marcus declared, his voice rising with passion. "And we need to stand together to demand change. We can't let fear silence us. We need to amplify our voices until they're heard." Dana felt her heart race. The fire in Marcus's words ignited something within her. She raised her hand hesitantly, feeling the weight of her own experience pressing against her chest. When Marcus acknowledged her, she stood up, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm Dana Carter, and my husband is the police commissioner," she began, the room falling silent. The faces turned toward her, some curious, others skeptical. "I was searched and detained yesterday by 2 officers in a situation that felt unjust and humiliating. I never imagined I would experience this kind of treatment, and I want to use my voice to advocate for change, not just for myself, but for everyone who has faced similar injustices." A murmur of recognition swept through the crowd. Marcus smiled encouragingly, and the atmosphere shifted. "Thank you for sharing your story, Dana. It's important for people to see that this issue affects all of us, regardless of our background or status. This isn't just about individuals. It's about a systemic problem that we must confront together." The meeting continued, with Dana actively participating, asking questions, and sharing ideas for how they could work together to foster change in Granville. By the time it ended, she felt empowered and hopeful. There was strength in unity, and she was beginning to see how her experience could inspire action. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Dana returned home, her spirit lifted despite the weight of her earlier experience. She found Ethan sitting at the dining room table, papers strewn about, deep in thought. When he looked up and saw her, his expression brightened, though it was still tinged with the seriousness of the day. "How was the meeting?" he asked, setting down a document and leaning forward, his interest piqued. "It was powerful," Dana replied, excitement bubbling in her voice. "I spoke about what happened, and the community was really supportive. They want to help, and I think we can actually start making a difference." Ethan's brow furrowed slightly as he considered her words. "What kind of difference?" Dana took a seat across from him, her hands animated as she spoke. "We talked about holding forums, engaging the community in conversations about police conduct, and how we can work together to promote accountability. I believe that if we unite our voices, we can push for change within the police department." Ethan nodded slowly, clearly impressed. "That sounds like a great start. But remember, Change can be slow and difficult. There will be resistance. Are you ready for that? I know it won't be easy, but I'm ready, Donna replied, her voice steady. I want to be part of the solution, not just for myself, but for everyone who feels unheard. Ethan studied her for a moment, pride swelling in his chest. He had always admired Dana's strength and determination, but seeing her take such a stand gave him hope. Then let's do this together, he said, reaching across the table to hold her hand. You're not alone in this. I'll support you every step of the way. The conversation turned toward strategy as they mapped out a plan for how they could involve the community and the police department. Dana shared her thoughts about collaborating with the local civil rights groups, and Ethan spoke about his vision for a more transparent police force. They talked late into the night, both fueled by a renewed sense of purpose. As they finally wrapped up their discussion, Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. I just hope the officers are receptive to the changes we want to implement. I'll be meeting with them soon to discuss disciplinary action, but I also want to talk about broader reform. Dana's expression turned serious. Do you think they'll be open to it? Ethan shrugged, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Honestly, it depends on how defensive they get. Officers like Blake might see this as an attack rather than an opportunity to grow. But I can't let that deter me. The department needs to change, and if they're not willing to adapt, they shouldn't be wearing the badge. Dana squeezed his hand, comforted by his conviction. I know you'll handle it with integrity. Just remember, you're setting an example, not just for the officers, but for the entire community. They spent a few more moments in comfortable silence, their hands still intertwined, both aware of the challenges ahead. The night had settled in around them, wrapping the world outside in darkness, but inside their home, the light of hope flickered brightly. As Donna prepared for bed later that night, she felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement. This was the beginning of something bigger than herself, a chance to contribute to the fight against injustice in her city. She closed her eyes, envisioning a future where her experience could help pave the way for others, and a deep sense of determination filled her as she drifted into a restless sleep, dreaming of the change she hoped to see. Breaking barriers. The sun rose on another day in Granville, but for Dana, it felt different. Today was the day of Ethan's meeting with Officers Blake and Thomas. She had spent the night tossing and turning, her mind racing with possibilities. What would happen in that room? Would the officers take responsibility for their actions, or would they become defensive and try to shift the blame? More importantly, how would Ethan handle it? As she sipped her morning coffee, Dana's thoughts drifted to the meeting scheduled for later that afternoon. She had spent the morning poring over notes from the community meeting, gathering her own thoughts and reflections on the conversations that had unfolded. The air in the house was thick with anticipation, and Dana felt the weight of it pressing down on her. Ethan emerged from their bedroom, his uniform crisp and his expression determined. He looked every bit the commissioner he was, but Dana could see the tension in his shoulders. She knew he was preparing himself for a difficult conversation. Are you ready? Dana asked, her voice steadied despite her own nerves. I am, Ethan replied, though she could hear the slight tremor in his voice. But I won't lie. I'm nervous about how they'll react. Dana reached out, squeezing his hand reassuringly. You've got this, Ethan. Just remember to stick to the facts and keep it focused on the need for change. This isn't just about them. It's about the department and the community. He nodded, appreciating her support. Thanks, Donna. I'm glad you're by my side in all of this. With one last lingering look, he grabbed his keys and headed for the door. I'll see you later, okay? Good luck, she called after him, her heart pounding as she watched him leave. The hours passed slowly for Dana as she busied herself around the house, attempting to distract herself from the anxiety that gnawed at her. She tidied up, organized the living room, and even attempted to cook a comforting dinner, though her mind wandered to the meeting time and again. The clock seemed to move at a crawl, each tick amplifying her worries. Finally, as the afternoon sun began to dip in the sky, she decided to head out for a walk. She needed fresh air, a break from her thoughts, and perhaps a chance to clear her mind before the day's events reached their climax. Granville's downtown area bustled with life as families walked their dogs. Children played in the park, and the sounds of laughter echoed from the cafes. Dana strolled past familiar storefronts, each one a reminder of her life in this city. She watched a group of kids playing soccer, their laughter infectious, and felt a pang of longing for simpler days when her biggest concern was which cafe to visit for lunch. As she walked, her thoughts shifted to the stories she had heard during the community meeting. So many people had experienced similar encounters with law enforcement, stories of discrimination, wrongful accusations, and humiliating treatment. It was a harsh reality, but it also fueled her resolve to fight for change. When she returned home, the sun was low in the sky, casting a warm glow across the living room. She checked her phone and saw that Ethan had sent her a message. "Meeting is over. Let's talk when I get home." Her heart raced. Had it gone well? Had they acknowledged their mistakes? The question swirled in her mind, but she reminded herself to stay calm. Whatever had happened, she would face it head-on. When Ethan finally walked through the door, his expression was a mix of exhaustion and determination. Dana felt her stomach flutter as she studied his face for clues about the meeting. "Hey," he said, dropping his bag by the door and rubbing his temples. "Can we talk?" "Of course," Dana replied, her voice steady, but filled with anticipation. Ethan led her to the living room, and they settled on the couch, facing each other. He took a deep breath, preparing to share what had transpired. "First of all, I want you to know that I confronted Blake and Thomas directly," he began, his voice steady but low. "I made it clear that their behavior was unacceptable, and I emphasized the need for accountability." Dana nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "And what did they say?" "They were defensive at first. Blake tried to justify his actions, claiming they were just following protocol," Ethan replied, his jaw tightening at the memory. "But I pressed him on it. I asked him what kind of protocol allows for the unjust treatment of a citizen without cause." "How did he respond?" Dana asked, leaning forward, eager for details. "He stumbled over his words, trying to find a way to shift the blame," Ethan continued. "But I reminded him that the law is not just about procedures. It's about respect and understanding the community we serve. I told them that treating someone like a criminal without any reason is not only wrong but damaging to the very fabric of our community." A flicker of pride welled up within Dana at Ethan's words. "That's exactly what needs to be said," she encouraged, her voice rising slightly. "What else happened?" Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I also laid out some steps we're going to take moving forward. I want to implement new training programs focused on bias recognition and community engagement. We can't keep operating as if these problems don't exist. We need to confront them head-on." Dana felt a rush of hope at his commitment to real change. "That's amazing, Ethan. I'm so proud of you." "Thank you," he said, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that melted away some of the tension. "But there's more. I want to hold a community forum next month where citizens can come in and share their experiences, just like you did. We need to open the lines of communication between the department and the people we serve." Dana's heart soared at the thought. "That's a fantastic idea. It could really help bridge the gap and give people a platform to express their concerns." "I hope so," Ethan replied, a small smile creeping onto his face. "But I need your help with it. You have a way of connecting with people that I can't match. You're the one who can bring the community together." "I'd love to help," Dana said eagerly. "I can reach out to the groups I met with and see if we can collaborate on the forum. It's important for everyone to feel heard." Ethan's expression shifted, becoming more serious again. "There's one last thing I need to tell you about. After our meeting, I made it clear that there would be disciplinary action for both Blake and Thomas. I won't let them off the hook just because they're officers." Dana's heart sank slightly. While she understood the need for accountability, She also felt a sense of unease at the thought of what that might mean for those officers. "What kind of action?" she asked carefully. Ethan hesitated for a moment before continuing. "They'll face a formal reprimand, and I'm going to recommend that they undergo additional training. But I also made it clear that this is a pivotal moment for them. If they cannot adapt and change their approach, I will not hesitate to take further action." Dana nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. It was a difficult balance to strike, wanting to hold them accountable while also recognizing the need for reform within the system. "I appreciate that, Ethan. Change is hard, and it takes time, but it's necessary." They sat together in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Dana felt a mixture of relief and resolve. While the journey ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, she knew they were on the right path. They were not just confronting individual actions, they were tackling a systemic issue that required collective effort and courage. As they moved forward, Dana felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just the wife of the police commissioner. She was an advocate for change, ready to fight for justice in her community. Together, she and Ethan would work to ensure that no one would have to endure what she had experienced. No one would feel the sting of unjust treatment simply because of who they were. As the evening stretched on, Dana and Ethan began to outline their plan for the community forum. They spoke animatedly about potential speakers, topics for discussion, and ways to engage citizens. Each idea sparked new energy between them, their combined passion igniting a fire that made them feel unstoppable. The future might still be uncertain, but Dana felt a sense of hope blossoming in her heart. Together, they would break down barriers, challenge the status quo, and pave the way for a more just Granville, a city where everyone felt valued, respected, and heard. The community forum. As the days turned into weeks, the anticipation for the community forum grew, transforming Dana's anxiety into a determined focus. With Ethan's leadership and her own burgeoning resolve, they worked tirelessly to organize the event, reaching out to local activists, community leaders, and residents to ensure a diverse array of voices would be heard. Flyers were distributed, social media campaigns launched, and local news stations were notified, all aimed at drawing attention to the important conversations they hoped to facilitate. On the morning of the forum, Dana woke early, feeling a blend of excitement and nervousness coursing through her. She had spent the night tossing and turning, rehearsing her speech in her mind and preparing for the diverse audience she would address. As she showered, she mentally reviewed the key points she wanted to convey: the importance of community trust, the necessity of police accountability, and the need for open dialogues between law enforcement and the citizens they served. The venue chosen for the forum was the Granville Community Center, a familiar and welcoming space that had hosted numerous events over the years. It felt appropriate, a hub of community activity that symbolized unity and collaboration. As Donna arrived at the center, she was greeted by the sight of chairs being set up in a semicircle, facing a small stage adorned with a banner reading, "Voices for Change, Community Forum on Police Accountability." The energy in the air was palpable. A mix of familiar faces and new ones filled the space as volunteers set up refreshments and arranged seating. Dana recognized some community leaders she had spoken to at previous meetings and felt encouraged by their presence. As people arrived, there were quiet conversations filled with hopeful anticipation. Ethan arrived shortly after, looking sharp in his uniform, but visibly relaxed compared to the weeks leading up to this day. He walked over to Donna, a reassuring smile spreading across his face. "Are you ready?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. Dana took a deep breath, feeling the surge of determination. "I think so. I just want to make sure everyone feels heard today." "You will," Ethan assured her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "This is about opening up those channels of communication. You've prepared well, and your passion will shine through." As the forum began, Dana took a moment to observe the crowd. The room was filled with people of all ages, races, and backgrounds: families, young adults, seniors, and even local students. It was a beautiful tapestry of the community, all brought together by a shared desire for change. Ethan opened the forum with a few words, thanking everyone for coming and emphasizing the importance of dialogue and building trust between the police and the community. His words resonated with the audience, who listened intently, nodding in agreement. Then he introduced Donna, who stood up to take the stage, her heart racing. As she stepped into the spotlight, she felt a wave of warmth wash over her, but the nervousness lingered at the edges of her mind. She took a deep breath and began. "Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here today," Dana said, her voice steady. "My name is Dana Carter, and I am the wife of Police Commissioner Ethan Carter. But more importantly, I am a resident of Granville, just like you. I am here to share my story and to advocate for change, not just for myself, but for everyone who has faced unfair treatment in our community." The audience listened attentively, and Dana could see the empathy reflected in their expressions. She continued, sharing her experience from the day she had been stopped and searched by Officers Blake and Thomas. She spoke candidly about the humiliation and fear she had felt, emphasizing how it was not just an isolated incident, but a reflection of a larger systemic issue. "I want you all to know that you are not alone," she declared, her voice growing stronger. "We are here today because we believe in a community where everyone feels safe and respected, regardless of their background. We must stand together to challenge the prejudices that exist within our systems and work towards building a better future for Granville." After her speech, the audience erupted in applause, and a sense of energy filled the room. Dana stepped down from the stage, feeling a sense of relief and exhilaration. She had shared her truth, and it felt liberating. The forum continued with an open dialogue where community members were invited to share their own experiences. One by one, people stood up to speak, their voices shaking with emotion as they recounted stories of encounters with law enforcement that left them feeling powerless and marginalized. A middle-aged man spoke of being stopped for a broken taillight and treated with suspicion, despite having done nothing wrong. A young woman shared her story of witnessing friends being unjustly targeted by police during a routine stop. An elderly lady recounted how her son had been treated with disrespect during a simple traffic violation, a moment that had haunted her for years. Each story resonated deeply with the audience, creating a tapestry of shared experiences that united them in their pain and frustration. Dana listened intently, her heart aching for each person who spoke, but also filling with hope as the conversation flowed. The room was alive with a sense of purpose, and for the first time in a long time, Dana felt the weight of injustice beginning to lift, replaced by a collective desire for change. Ethan took notes throughout the discussions, engaging with the speakers and making it clear that their voices were being heard. After each personal story, he offered his support and emphasized that the police department was committed to addressing these issues, fostering a culture of respect and ensuring that officers were held accountable for their actions. As the forum progressed, it became clear that there was a growing appetite for change. Community members began brainstorming solutions together, discussing ways to enhance police training, improve community relations, and establish channels for ongoing dialogue between citizens and law enforcement. Toward the end of the forum, a woman stood up, her voice filled with emotion. "I want to thank you both for putting this together," she said, tears in her eyes. "It's about time we had a conversation like this. We need to keep talking, keep sharing, and keep pushing for change." As the forum concluded, Dana felt a deep sense of gratitude and fulfillment. They had created a space for voices that often went unheard, and now, together, they were setting the foundation for change. As people began to disperse, several individuals approached Dana and Ethan to express their appreciation, and many offered to collaborate on future events to maintain the momentum they had built. "Today was incredible," Ethan said as they began to clean up the room, a bright smile on his face. "I can't believe how many people came together. This is just the beginning." Dana nodded, her heart swelling with pride. I think we've opened a door, Ethan, and we can't let it close again. We have to keep pushing for accountability and transparency, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. They finished tidying up the room, exchanging ideas for their next steps. With every conversation and collaboration, they felt more hopeful about the future of Granville. As they headed home that evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The warmth of the day lingered in the air, and as they drove through the familiar streets, Dana felt a renewed sense of purpose and hope. The journey ahead would undoubtedly be filled with challenges, but they were no longer alone in the fight for change. They had forged a community united in their quest for justice. As they pulled into their driveway, Dana glanced over at Ethan, her heart filled with love and admiration for the man beside her. They were partners in every sense of the word, united not only in marriage but also in their commitment to create a better world for themselves and their community. "Let's keep this momentum going," Dana said as they got out of the car. "We can turn this into a movement." "I agree," Ethan replied, determination etched across his features. "We'll keep fighting, and together, we'll make a difference." Hand in hand, they stepped into their home, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that they were part of something bigger, a community poised for change, standing together against injustice, and committed to building a future that would ensure everyone in Granville felt safe and respected.